Hey friends, thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation Dick and I had about shock absorbers, or dampers. If you haven't already, make sure to listen to our Aero 101 and ground effect episodes. During these conversations, Dick stated that a discussion of shock absorbers would be a good idea. Why? Because shock absorbers play a key role in the compromise that has to be achieved for ride control and bump control when considering ground effect. Also, we need your help. Please make sure you are following and rating us on your favorite podcast apps, as well as listening and sharing episodes with other F1 fans. This episode would be great for new fans. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Dick, we're going to do another one of these tech talks. Sound good?
Bring it on.
Okay. It kind of feels a little intimidating to me because I'm trying to figure out in my head where this item that we're talking about sits in the car. And I have a feeling there are other people out there feeling the same way I do, but I understand from you that this is actually a very important part of the car, especially in the ground effects era. So here's what we're going to talk about. Shock absorbers and or dampers, right? They're basically two different ways of saying the same thing. Am I right?
They are.
Okay. So what is a damper and what exactly does it do?
So what you have to do is you have to think about, first of all, what is a spring, or in Formula One cars, they use what's called a torsion bar, which is really just a different way of providing, resistance to the motion that you will have in the suspension. But let's talk about springs because it's a little bit easier for people to understand. And a spring is nothing more than basically a piece of very heavy steel wire, let's call it that is wound to make a spring. And when a force is put on it vertically, that spring compresses. And when that force is removed, it goes back to its original position. But what's interesting is that when a spring is compressed and then released, a couple of things happen. Number one, it oscillates at a certain frequency that is the frequency that is basically its natural frequency of that particular piece of wire that's been wound, basically. And it can change depending on the thickness of the metal. It can change depending on how close the coils are to one another. There's all sorts of different ways. And so you get this oscillation where the thing is vibrating up and down as it eventually settles, okay? And so the shock absorber, in the case of springs that are used on a racing car, the shock absorber actually rides inside the springs. It's a long tube, basically, and has one end that is connected to the suspension. The other end is connected to the chassis, so it's secure. And then the spring itself rides on these what's called spring perches. And the spring perch is mounted to the shock absorber, and the spring works against those spring perches to provide that resistance then to the movement of the suspension, whether it's going up and down as it hits a bump or then goes past the bump. So there's a lot going on there, but here's the main thing, and here's what the casual fan needs to know. Because springs are being constantly compressed and then released as a car goes over the road, think about hitting a bump, right? You hit a bump, and what happens? Well, the tire or tires that hit the bump, they go up in the air, right? They're not going to leave the ground, but they're going to go up within the range of motion of the suspension. And then you get past the bump and they go back down again because the spring's pressing against that suspension component. And so if you don't have anything to dampen out that natural frequency or oscillation in the car, then the car is going to be pitching and bucking all over the place. And so when they first started putting, shock absorbers, or more properly dampers, on the car, it really was just to control the car as it went over the bumps. There was very little thought given to any of the other things that a suspension needs to provide optimum performance. So
Can I interrupt you for a second?
of course.
Okay, so it sounds like when you go off-roading, it's like you're is it then we're feeling the shock absorbers doing its best to keep the car like as you said, not going up into the air, but like that's when it's in that when the field is not level, right? That's when you're feeling it the most.
Right.
Do you see what I'm trying to say? Like
Yep. Yeah, it's
I
the
feel like
springs
I
and the
feel it,
shock.
but I don't realize it when I'm
Right.
happening, what the shock absorber is actually kind of absorbing and
Right.
helping to get us back onto that equal comforting when you say that not pitching and back and forth.
Right.
So am I on the right track?
Yeah, you're absolutely on the right track. And so,
Okay.
the springs and the dampers work in concert with one another. But let's say you were to go and drive your car off-road, but you didn't have any dampers on it. Whatever the bumps were that you would be hitting while you're driving off-road, they're going to be far worse.
Gotcha.
The car is going to
Gotcha.
be all over the place. It
Right.
becomes very difficult to drive.
And then if we now transfer that over to the F1 car, that's horrible because of the ground effects, but even
Yep.
more the high speeds, the car is
Yep.
going, you don't want it to be pitching back and forth like that.
No.
Okay. Okay,
No.
so how I think you started to go in this direction, but let me ask this very clearly for any of our audience. How exactly does the damper work?
Yeah, so basically just think of a long tube. And again, one side is connected to the chassis, the other side is connected to the suspension in some form or fashion. Usually, we've been hearing a lot about push rod versus pull rod suspension. So that push rod is what actually connects to the shock absorber. As does the pull rod. And then around this tube is where the spring is, and the tube is set up with these spring perches to very quickly allow for springs to be changed if the engineers decide they want to go to a stiffer spring or a softer spring, whatever. It's real easy to swap them out, and they're designed that way for a racing car. But anyway, within the tube that is the body of the shock, you basically have a shaft, which goes up the length of the tube. And at the other end of it is a piston that is pushing basically an oil, for lack of a better term. It's an oil that goes through these basically discs that have holes drilled in them that then regulate the motion of the fluid. So as the piston goes upwards, say it's hitting a bump and it goes upwards towards the top of the shock absorber, it's shoving this oil through these holes. And we've all seen what happens, like when you have a garden hose and you're spraying, you've got the water just coming out of the hose. But then if you put your thumb over the end of the hose and block off some of the water, you can feel the pressure build up, and the water accelerates on the part where it's coming out, right? Well, that really is kind of what's going on with a shock, except that it's all in a closed environment. And so what they do is they can vary the shape of the piston and the size of the various holes on those discs to then change the characteristics of the shock absorber depending on what the racetrack looks like. Is it bumpy? Is it smooth? Do you have heavy springs? Do you have soft springs? Those sorts of things. And so that resistance that's caused by forcing that oil through those holes in those discs is what ultimately controls the spring's natural tendency to oscillate as it hits a bump. Clear as mud, right?
No, that actually makes sense, especially when you gave the example of the garden hose. That really is what helped me to understand what
good.
you were saying. So fantastic analogy. Okay, so then how does this affect the performance of the race car itself?
Yeah, so for decades, and I kind of alluded to this already, really no one paid a lot of attention to the dampers because there was really no need for a lot of ride control. They wanted to just make sure that, when they hit a bump, the tires didn't come off the ground and that sort of thing. But they really didn't pay a whole lot of attention to them. And then with the advent of ground effect cars, you needed to keep that car as parallel, the belly of the car as parallel to the road surface as possible. And of course, you have bumps, you have corners you're going around and you're having chassis roll. And so what happened was, because they really didn't understand what shock absorbers could do, what the designers back in the late 70s and early 80s did was they started throwing these incredibly stiff springs at the cars to keep them as level as possible. And so the cars became like massive go-karts, and really the only springing that the car really had was compression of the tire sidewalls. So think about that. When you're producing that kind of downforce in a car that light, and the only real spring you have is the sidewall spring. And so they got thinking about it. The problem is that when you add stiffer springs to the car, or stiffer anti-roll bars, which is a totally different conversation, as you do that, you increase the total amount of spring rate that a particular corner of the car might have. And so when you do that, you're actually taking away mechanical grip. Ideally, to get more mechanical grip, what you would do is you would run the softest springs that you could get away with. And that would be the deal, so that when you're in the slow speed corners and all that, that's where you would have an advantage, because you would have more grip. And so they were constantly fighting back and forth until one day they realized, hey, wait a minute, with the dampers, instead of just, controlling the car in bump, we can also control it as it rolls into the corner. And they did this by doing a couple things, and that is that they realized that it's not only how much resistance that the shock provided towards being compressed, like in a bump, but it was also the resistance or the speed at which that shock shaft would go and extend back to its normal place after a bump. And so by controlling the speed of that, what they call rebound, you suddenly had the ability to keep a car flat. And the way to think about it is let's say you're going into a left-hand corner, the car is going to roll to the right? The right side of the car is going to compress. But as the right side of the car compresses on the suspension, the left side of the car is actually extending. It's actually getting longer because the tires are staying on the ground. So what they realized is that if you could go and have the shock characteristics set up, a certain way, you could actually use the shocks to resist the roll on the right side. In other words, the compression on the right side of the car, the compression of the shock would reduce or eliminate the roll. And at the same time, the left side tires, because the rebound on that shock absorber was adjusted, it would then contribute to keeping the car flatter because it wouldn't extend as quickly.
Wow.
And so what happened was they suddenly said, oh, wow, I can keep this car upright without having to run, 4,000 pound springs on a 1,500 pound car. I can get away with 2,000 pound springs. In other words, increasing the mechanical grip. And when I say a 2,000 pound spring, what I mean is it takes 2,000 pounds of force to compress the spring 1 inch. That's what that means. And so by doing that, suddenly the cars were able to go over the bumps and yet keep the aerodynamic platform the same. And so, when ground effects was eliminated back in the 80s, and we went back to a more conventional, what they call a flat bottom car, the shocks by this time had gotten to be so valuable in tuning the car that they still ran with the super sophisticated shocks, even though they didn't have ground effects.
Okay, so you can't see me, our audience can't see me, but as you were describing the whole turning into the corner, I literally was turning into a corner. Like I was in my brain. And so for anybody who is still confused and you weren't doing that, I tell you do that. It'll make sense what Dick just said, because then you can understand the whole rebound, and then what was the opposite word? Compression versus rebound. As you said that, I was like, wow, that's genius to understand how you can manipulate, and that's a good word in this context, manipulate it and be able to use every literal inch to your benefit. Are those all the mechanical considerations that influence the dampers? Are there any others?
Well, there's some techie things that I think are worth spending just a couple minutes on. But, one of the things is that as they started developing these shocks, they realized that the shaft speed on a damper is either high speed or low speed. And what they mean by that is that high speed is like you hit a bump in the road. It's like a boom and it's done, right? Whereas low speed is like that chassis roll that we just talked about. It's a much more gradual thing, so it's much slower. And so if you think about it, you're forcing oil through these holes in the disc, and it becomes much harder the faster that piston moves, right? A high speed kind of compression. That high speed compression makes it tougher to push that oil through the holes, whereas the low speed, it flows a whole lot easier. So now you have the way that you can go about tuning it, right? And so you're very interested in the compression of the shaft, but they're also very interested, like we talked about, in that rebound.
So when you said about the oil going in and out fast and low speed and high speed, is that kind of like when I'm trying to transfer, let's say, oil through a funnel into another jar? I have to be very mindful about how fast I'm putting it through that funnel. Is that the
That's
same? Is it the
exactly
same
right.
for him? Okay.
Same kind of deal. Yep.
Okay. Okay. Because the
Yep.
more you put in, the harder it is for it to go through that narrow space. But if you give it
Correct.
time, it'll can flow much faster. Okay. Okay.
Yep.
Got it.
Yep.
All right. Sorry, I interrupted you. Keep going.
That is quite all right. So when they first started getting these shocks, they were only adjustable for compression and for rebound. They really didn't pay any attention to high speed or low speed. But as they started developing them, the shocks became four-way adjustable. You had high speed and low speed adjustability for compression, high speed and low speed adjustability for rebound. And then there are some shocks out there that are actually five-way adjustable. They've got the four that we just described, but then there's another one where, like, if both wheels hit a bump at the same time, there's the fifth valve that basically blows out and allows the extra compliance because of the bigger hit that they take. Basically, I've never dealt with a five-way adjustable shock. I've only done the two-way and the four-way adjustable shocks, but basically that's what goes on.
Oh my word. I'm sorry. That we're going to have another conversation on that at some point. Whether or not we do it online is a whole nother thing, but wow, that's awesome. I mean, not just the four, but you just said a five. It's just the ingenuity of how you can think outside of what seems observable by your eye. Just the level of scientific ingenuity is just amazing to me. But I don't want to get you off track. Keep going. How does this actually make a race car faster? All this work that we just said.
Yeah. So with the advances that they've made in shock technology, you have to remember that there's basically two ways that they can adjust the shock. They can go and change the internal components, primarily the shape of the piston, and then those discs with the holes in it. They can be bigger, smaller, whatever, depending on the characteristics that the shock engineer wants to have. They also are adjustable on the outside. There's literally four different knobs on a four-way adjustable shock to adjust each of those kinds of characteristics. And you literally can take a car that is an understeering car, make some shock adjustments, and the next thing you know, you have a car that is neutral or maybe even oversteery. It's amazing. I've done it myself.
Okay, wait, maybe this should be obvious, but I'm not picking it up. Where exactly are the dampers, the shock absorbers located?
So they're attached to the suspension. One side's attached to the suspension, one side's attached to the chassis, right?
Okay.
And the shock itself is inside the spring. That's why when you might hear about a coilover shock. What that means is that the coils literally are over the shock absorber.
Okay. So then are you adjusting this throughout the race, or is this between races?
This is between races. You'll come in and you'll make an adjustment and you'll go back out. It's usually the engineer will go and prescribe it.
Okay.
Yeah. And, they'll say to the mechanic, hey, I want 2 more clicks of rebound after he talks to the cart or to the driver or whatever the case may be.
So these would be the things that during free practice, you're expecting the driver to give you feedback on, so that way you know how to properly set it up for Grand Prix day.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Got it.
Yep.
Okay. Anything else that you want to highlight about how this makes the car go faster?
Yeah. So, in many cases, the low speed characteristics of the dampers have eliminated the need for anti-roll bars, which again, we haven't talked much about, but by eliminating the need for anti-roll bars, and we've already gone softer on the springs, that just gets you more mechanical grip. And so that in itself then becomes a competitive advantage. And so in general, the thing to remember is the softer you go with the overall spring rate, the more mechanical grip you will achieve on a given car. And I really believe that a lot of what's going on with the success that Red Bull has had with the ground effects cars is that Newey has figured out not only just a superior aerodynamic package, but he's figured out a suspension system, which includes the shocks, that keeps that car in a very, very narrow aerodynamic window, which then optimizes their ground effect that they're getting.
Okay, based off of everything you just said, you've made the case to me, and I agree with you about this final statement about Newey and the design of the car.
Yeah.
Like based off of how you just laid it out, I'm on your side on this. So ultimately, what is the key takeaway our listeners need to have from this conversation if their head is not spinning? Hopefully it's not spinning, because it actually made sense to me. Dick, this is like so technical that can overwhelm people, but I feel like you did a very good job. But what do they need to remember when they're going to watch a race?
Yeah, so let's keep it really simple and let's talk in really general terms here. But basically, a bumpy track is going to require softer springs and a somewhat higher ride height, which is the distance between the belly of the car and the road surface, right? Because as you go over the bumps, you've got to have the car a little bit higher off the ground. Well, as we've learned, the higher you go on ride height, the less ground effect you make. So you're constantly working for a compromise of how can I get over the bumps with the car as low as possible without grinding the belly of the car off of the track surface, right? Whereas on a fast track with a really smooth surface, you're going to have to run stiffer springs because you're going to be producing more downforce as speed increases. And so the car is going to naturally want to get lower and lower in its ride height. And so you've got to have those stiffer springs, again, to keep the belly of the car off the pavement. Now, all race cars touch the track a little bit, but what you don't want to have them do is hit the track really hard. So in both of these scenarios, then the whole game is keep the belly of the car from grinding itself into the road surface, and those dampers work with the springs to play a key role in the compromise that has to be achieved for ride control and bump control in the situations that are given for a particular circuit. So, you think about Monaco, which is, slow speed, bumpy, you're going to run softer springs, you're going to have a higher ride height than you would at a fast track that's smooth, like a Silverstone or a Monza, as an example.
That makes sense. So good. Thank you.
My pleasure. I can geek off on this stuff really.
I'm geeking out with you. And I'm not, as we know, I'm not a STEM person, but this makes me excited. It's very accessible for a non-STEM person like me. So thank you for trying to make it easy for the rest of us to understand.
My pleasure.
I look forward to the next tech conversation with you.
Absolutely.
Okay, friends, what did you think of our conversation? Drop me a line via email, Sabrina@2guysagirlandf1.com. Also, we need your help. Please make sure you are following and rating us on your favorite podcast apps, as well as listening and sharing episodes with other F1 fans. This episode would be great for new fans. And with that, let me say, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in, because we're just two guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.